If you were a tradesman in Ontario, Aikenhead's wasn't just a hardware store. It was the place you went when nowhere else had what you needed. 6 floors on Temperance Street, where a man behind the counter could identify a Robertson head by sight and pull the right fitting before you'd finished describing the job. At its peak, Aikenhead's operated 22 stores across the province, Canada's oldest hardware retailer, with a name on the door that predated Confederation by 37 years. They survived the Rebellion of 1837, survived the Great Fire, survived 2 world wars, the Depression, the oil shock, and every recession the country threw at them. And then, after 164 years of selling hardware in Toronto, the name came down from every storefront and was replaced by an orange sign from Atlanta. How does a company that outlasted everything simply disappear? What went wrong? Chapter 1. The Ironmonger and the Mud. The story begins on a street corner that doesn't remember what it witnessed. The northeast corner of King and Yonge Streets in 1830 was not the intersection you'd recognize today. There were no glass towers, no streetcars, no traffic lights. The town was called York. It had a population of 2,860 people, and the streets were unpaved ruts of clay and standing water so persistent that locals had given the place a second name, Muddy York. It wouldn't become Toronto for another 4 years. It wouldn't become a city for another 4 years after that. Upper Canada was a British colonial frontier governed by Lieutenant Governor John Colborne and dominated by a small aristocratic clique called the Family Compact. Yonge Street, the artery north, had been surveyed under Lieutenant Governor Simcoe barely 36 years earlier. Cholera would kill over 200 townspeople the following year. This is where Joseph Redoute opened a hardware store. Not a hardware store in the modern sense, an ironmongery. The word itself tells you the era. It's the language of Georgian England transplanted to the northern edge of the British Atlantic world. Rideout sold what a frontier garrison town needed: nails, hinges, locks, axes, plow irons, scythes, saws, chimney fittings. His customers were construction tradesmen, ship's chandlers, blacksmiths, farmers coming in along the new Yonge Street concession roads, soldiers from the Fort York garrison, and the immigrants who were arriving from the British Isles at a rate that would triple the town's population in 4 years. In the decade of the 1830s, 193,000 people arrived in Upper Canada from Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales. They needed to build houses. They needed hardware. Rideout had it. He ran the firm under his own name and later, with his brother, George P. Rideout, as Rideout Bros. And Company. George helped organize the Toronto Board of Trade in 1845 and served as its first president, a marker of how fast this frontier ironmonger had become a civic institution. 15 years from muddy crossroads to the presidency of the Board of Trade. That was the trajectory of early Toronto commerce, and Rideout's hardware was riding it. But the man whose name would eventually replace Rideout's on the storefront was, in 1830, a 14-year-old boy in County Kilkenny, Ireland. He wouldn't arrive for another 17 years. And when he did, he wouldn't arrive as a merchant or a capitalist. He'd arrive as a clerk. Chapter 2. The clerk from Kilkenny, James Aikenhead, was born in 1816 in County Kilkenny, in the southeast of Ireland. The surname is Scottish in origin. There's a village called Aikenhead near Glasgow. And the family's deeper ancestry was almost certainly Scots-Irish, part of the Ulster plantation wave. But James himself was born and raised in Ireland, and when he sailed for Toronto in 1847, he sailed from an Ireland in the worst year of the Great Famine, 1847, the year the potato blight reached its killing peak. The year of the gross eel typhus disaster, when thousands of Irish emigrants died in quarantine ships anchored in the St. Lawrence. The year tens of thousands of Irish landed in British North America carrying nothing but their survival. James Aikenhead was 31 years old when he walked into Joseph D. Rideout and Company and asked for work. He was hired as a junior clerk. No portrait of his personality survives in the public record. No letters, no diary entries, no quoted remarks. What survives is the institutional trajectory, and it speaks clearly enough about the type. Within 21 years of being hired as a clerk, James Aikenhead was a named partner in the firm. Within 29 years, he jointly controlled it. Within 46 years, his son owned it outright. This is the classic 19th century Toronto rise through the firm arc. The immigrant clerk who outlasts the founders, outlasts the partners, and quietly inherits the institution. Not through brilliance or spectacle, through endurance, through being the one who stays. In 1868, James and his colleague Alexander Crombie became full partners. The firm was renamed Redoubt, Aikenhead, and Crombie. The Aikenhead name had arrived on the storefront, sharing space, not yet alone, but present. 8 years later, in 1876, Aikenhead and Crombie acquired majority control of the business. The Redoubt family, who had opened the store when York was a village of fewer than 3,000 people, were eased out of the enterprise they'd built. On the 1st of September, 1873, James's son, Thomas E. Aikenhead, began a 5-year apprenticeship with the firm. This was not a casual arrangement. It was a deliberate dynastic installation, a father placing his son on the path that would complete what the father had started. Thomas apprenticed for 5 years, learned every department, learned the trade customers and the wholesale channels, and the accounting. And in 1893, 46 years after his father had arrived as a famine immigrant with nothing, Thomas E. Aikenhead bought out both Redoubt and Crombie outright. The firm was renamed Aikenhead Hardware Company. For the first time, the Aikenhead name stood alone over the door, 63 years after the store had opened, 46 years after James had walked off the boat. The ironmonger's shop on the muddy crossroads now belonged to the son of an Irish clerk, and the Redoubt name, which had been synonymous with that corner since before Toronto, was gone. In 1891, the company had already given up its original King and Yonge lease, the location it had held for 61 years, and moved to 6 Adelaide Street East. In 1901, it was reorganized as a limited stock company, Aikenhead Hardware Limited. The formalities of incorporation were catching up with a firm that had operated on handshakes and family authority for 7 decades. But the real transformation was still ahead. In 1905, Aikenhead's moved into its permanent home, the building that would define the company for the next 6 decades, and live in the memories of every Toronto tradesman who ever walked through its doors. 17 Temperance Street. Chapter 3. The Cathedral on Temperance Street. The building at 1721. Temperance Street sat just behind the financial district, where Bay Street meets Yonge, in the commercial heart of early 20th century Toronto. Part of the complex had previously housed the Comet Bicycle Company. Its 1894 facade, designed by E.J. Lennox, the architect who gave Toronto Old City Hall, was handsome enough to earn a heritage designation decades later. Aikenheads occupied and expanded the site from 1905 onward, turning it into something that transcended the ordinary meaning of the word store. 6 floors. Not 6 floors of the same thing arranged by price point, the way a modern retailer fills vertical space. 6 floors of distinct trades, electrical on one, plumbing on another, hand tools, builder's hardware, sporting goods, cutlery, locks, tractor parts, each department staffed by men who knew their inventory the way a librarian knows the shelves. The phrase that recurs in every surviving account, the phrase that became the store's unofficial motto, was simple: tax to tractors. If it was made of metal and you needed it to build, fix, wire, plumb, cut, fasten, hinge, or haul, Aikenheads had it. And if they didn't have it, the standing promise was that they'd find it for you. The granularity of the stock was the point. You could buy a single screw. 1 screw. The precise screw you needed for the precise job you were doing, pulled from a wooden bin by a man who could identify it by sight and tell you whether you actually wanted a Robertson or a slotted head for the application you'd described. And if you were a contractor outfitting a job site, you could buy them by the gross, 144 at a time, counted and bagged while you waited. This was not a retail experience in any sense a modern shopper would recognize. There were no shopping carts, no self-checkout, no overhead fluorescent lighting washing everything in the same flat glare. Temperance Street was a working building that happened to sell things to the public. The floors vibrated with foot traffic and the rattle of stock being moved on handcarts. The air carried the particular smell of a serious hardware operation. Machine oil, raw metal, the dry mineral scent of concrete dust, the faint chemical edge of solvents and paints, and underneath it all, the old wood smell of a building that had been absorbing decades of commerce into its floorboards. A man named Dr. Don R., whose father worked at the Temperance Street store in the 1920s, left a written account decades later describing what those childhood visits were like. His father made about $35 a week, modest even by the standards of the 20s, but steady, which in the hardware trade mattered more than lavish. The son remembered being brought to the store as a teaching exercise. His father would walk him through the departments, floor by floor, explaining what each tool was for, how each fitting worked, what each grade of steel could do. The store was the classroom. The merchandise was the curriculum. For a child growing up in interwar Toronto, a visit to Aikenhead's was an education in the physical world, in how things were made and how they held together. That testimonial captures something essential about what Aikenhead's was and what it meant to the people who used it. This was not a store you browsed. It was a store you consulted. The staff didn't wear name tags and ask if you needed help finding anything. The staff were the reason you came. They carried decades of accumulated knowledge about building hardware. What worked, what failed, what you actually needed versus what you thought you needed. A tradesman walking in with a problem would describe the job, and the man behind the counter would pull the right fitting, the right fastener, the right gauge of wire from memory. No computer inventory lookup, no calling the warehouse, just a man who'd been selling hardware since before the customer was born, reaching for the right bin without looking. One former customer, writing on a Canadian woodworking forum around 2010 about his experience in the 1970s, put it plainly. Aikenhead's was the first of the really big hardware stores. It was an amazing store on Temperance Street. When he was taking his trade test 32 years earlier, the only place to buy any kind of good hardware was at Aikenhead's. The phrasing is revealing. The only place. Not the best place, or the cheapest place, or the most convenient place. The only place. For a generation of Ontario tradesmen, Aikenhead's wasn't one option among many. It was the singular institution that could furnish a professional with everything a job required, under one roof, from people who understood what they were selling. Another former associate, identified only as Mr. G in a 2016 comment thread, described it with the economy of someone who'd worked there. 6 floors, electrical on one, plumbing on another, etc., etc. A real hardware store. The emphasis on real is the tell. By 2016, the speaker was drawing an implicit contrast between what Aikenhead's had been and what had replaced it. The distinction wasn't about size or stock count. It was about knowledge, about the difference between a store staffed by people who could identify a Robertson head by sight and a warehouse staffed by people trained to point you toward aisle 14. Chapter 4. The Empire in Ontario. The Temperance Street flagship was the cathedral, but by the middle of the 20th century, it was no longer the whole church. Beginning in 1937, under the leadership of James T. Aikenhead, Thomas's eldest son, who had joined the firm in 1911 and become president in 1944, the company began opening branches across the Toronto area and beyond. Over the next 3 decades, Aikenhead's stores appeared in Burlington, St. Catharines, Kitchener, Dundas, Markham, and Sudbury. They were anchor tenants at Yorkdale Shopping Centre when it opened in 1964, alongside Eaton's, Simpson's, and Kresge's, a positioning that tells you exactly where Aikenhead sat in the hierarchy of Ontario retail. Not a niche shop, not a specialty boutique, a first-tier anchor, sharing billing with the department store giants. The company also grew by acquisition. In 1965, Aikenhead's bought Russell Hardware Company, Limited. In the late 1960s, they acquired Hobbs Hardware Limited of London, Ontario, a firm with its own deep roots in southwestern Ontario hardware. By 1960, Aikenhead's had grown to 22 Ontario outlets with annual sales of approximately $22 million. In the landscape of Canadian retail at mid-century, this made them the dominant urban Ontario hardware retailer, and, by any reasonable measure, Canada's largest pure hardware retail business. The institutional culture of multi-generational employment ran deep. One former associate, writing years later, described starting as a teenager at the Cloverdale Mall branch and ending his career at the New Toronto store. Another commenter's father had worked at the Temperance Street location in the 1920s, and the commenter himself was being taken to the store as a child in the 1950s. 30 years later, the family connection unbroken. Aikenhead's was not a stopover job. It was a career. People joined and stayed, the way people stayed at institutions they believed would outlast them. A surviving Edward VII-era picture postcard in the University of Toronto's Discover archives shows the Temperance Street warehouse advertised with a handwritten message from a staff member named R.H. Falconer to a customer. Dear Sir, if convenient, call Saturday afternoon, Sep 29, and bring your plan. We'll save you a 10% discount if order is booked at once. Yours truly, R.H. Falconer. The casual intimacy of this, a handwritten note from a named employee to a named customer, offering to review building plans on a Saturday afternoon, discount included, tells you more about how Aikenhead's operated than any corporate history could. This was a business built on personal relationships between people who knew each other's names and each other's projects. The mail-order trade channel was a contractor service, not a mass-market catalog operation on the scale of Eaton's or Simpson Sears, but a professional network of builders, tradesmen, and suppliers who communicated by postcard, by telephone, and by walking through the door. The brand seeped into national consumer culture in smaller ways, too. In 1967, for the store's self-proclaimed 140th anniversary, Aikenhead circulated a promotional British penny, stamped to mark the occasion. The kind of small commercial ephemera that signals something important about how the firm saw itself. This was a company that believed it was a 19th-century institution. It traced its lineage to 1830, before Confederation, before responsible government, before the railway, before the telegraph. The promotional penny said, "We have been here longer than Canada has been a country." And in 1967, the centennial year, that claim carried weight. Through all of this, the family held on. James T.E. Aikenhead, the third generation, ran the company as president from 1944 until his sudden death on January 7, 1948, a loss that might have broken a less rooted institution. Instead, the presidency passed to Thomas's other son, John Wilfred Aikenhead, who held the office from 1948 to 1972. 5 generations of Aikenheads, James the clerk, Thomas the buyer, James T.E. the expansionist, J. Wilfred the steady hand, and finally James M. Aikenhead, Thomas's nephew, who became president in 1972, carried the firm across 141 years of continuous family involvement. 5 generations buried in the same family plot at Mount Pleasant Cemetery, Plot F, Circle, Lot 8. To understand what this company meant, you have to understand the ecosystem it lived in. Canadian Tire, founded in 1922, served the weekend do-it-yourselfer, the man painting his deck, changing his oil, buying a garden hose. Aikenhead served the professional, the electrician, the plumber, the general contractor outfitting a commercial job. The two coexisted because they served different worlds. Canadian Tire had the catalog, the Saturday morning crowd, and Canadian Tire money. Aikenhead's had the knowledge, the depth, and the tradesmen. It was the difference between a store you shopped at and a store you relied on. Home Hardware, founded in 1964 as a dealer-owned cooperative, took a different path entirely. Small-town independent dealers pooling purchasing power through a central co-op. Home Hardware would survive the coming storm essentially intact, growing to over 1,100 independently owned member stores. It is, in a sense, the Canadian hardware institution that Aikenhead's might have become if the family had structured ownership differently in 1971. But that is getting ahead of the story. Chapter 5. The Highest Shelf. Brought up by the late 1960s, Aikenhead's occupied a position that looked, from the outside, unassailable. 22 stores across Ontario, anchor tenant at Yorkdale, a flagship on Temperance Street that tradesmen drove across the city to visit. A workforce that measured tenure in decades, not months. a family name on the door that had been there since Confederation. The company had survived everything the 20th century had thrown at it. The Upper Canada Rebellion of 1837, when the firm was 7 years old and the political order of the colony was nearly overturned. The Great Toronto Fire of 1904, which destroyed over 100 buildings and caused $10 million in damage, just 1 year before the move to Temperance Street. 2 world wars, which disrupted supply chains and sent customers to the front. The Spanish flu. The Great Depression, during which the firm celebrated its 100th anniversary in 1930, commissioning a commemorative booklet that still sits in the Trent University archives, the 1973 oil shock. The brutal recession of 1981-82, 141 years of survival. 141 years of the Aikenhead name on the door, the family in the boardroom, the knowledge on the floor. If you'd stood in the Temperance Street building in 1970 and told any tradesman walking in that within 25 years the name would be gone, erased from every storefront, replaced by an orange sign from Atlanta, Georgia, they'd have thought you were out of your mind. But the seeds of what would come next were already in the ground. Not in the form of foreign competition. That was still decades away. Not in the form of technological disruption or changing consumer tastes. In the form of something quieter and more mundane. The family was tired. 5 generations is a long run. The firm had been handed from father to son, from brother to nephew for over a century. James M. Aikenhead, who became president in 1972, was the last of the line in the executive suite. And by the early 1970s, the decision had already been made. Not publicly, not dramatically, but in the way these decisions are always made in family-owned Canadian businesses, in conversations held in living rooms and accountants' offices, over coffee and balance sheets. The family was ready to sell. What nobody standing in that Temperance Street store could have known, what nobody in the family boardroom seems to have fully calculated, was what selling would set in motion. Not the sale itself, which was ordinary enough. Family businesses sell. Founders' grandchildren cash out. It happens in every country, in every industry, in every generation. The question was always going to be, to whom? And the answer, when it came, would determine whether 164 years of institutional memory would survive or be erased. The buyer was a brewery, and the brewery, in the end, would hand the keys to a competitor that hadn't existed when the first Aikenhead walked through the door. But that chapter begins in Montreal, in the offices of the Molson companies, where a chairman named Donald "Bud" Wilmot was about to make a bet on the do-it-yourself market that would eventually cost the Aikenhead name everything. Chapter 6. The Beer Barons Buy a Hardware Store. In 1971, the Aikenhead family sold their business to the Molson Companies of Montreal for just over $3 million. $3 million. For a company founded in 1830. For 22 stores across Ontario. For the Temperance Street flagship, and the name on the door, and the customer relationships that stretched back to the age of Edward VII, postcards, and handwritten Saturday afternoon appointments. $3 million. A figure that, even adjusted for the era, reflects less the value of what was being sold than the exhaustion of the people selling it. 5 generations had carried the firm. The 6th chose not to. The Molson chairman driving the acquisition was Donald "Bud" Wilmot, and his thesis was simple enough on paper. The do-it-yourself home improvement market was a coming growth wave in urban Canada. Middle-class homeowners in the suburbs of Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver were going to renovate their kitchens and finish their basements and build their decks, and whoever controlled the retail channel for that wave would ride it to enormous profits. Molson already brewed the beer those homeowners drank on Saturday afternoons. Now, it would sell them the lumber and the screws. The next year, 1972, Molson doubled down. It bought more than 90% of Beaver Lumber Company Limited for $50 million, nearly 17 times what it had paid for Aikenhead's. Beaver was the mirror image. Where Aikenhead's was urban and hardware tilted, Beaver was small town and lumber tilted, with a network of building supply outlets scattered across communities where the local Beaver lumber was as much a fixture as the post office. The strategic plan was to merge the two into a national home improvement powerhouse. Aikenhead's expertise and trade customer base married to Beaver's geographic reach and lumber yards. It did not work. Molson's own corporate history, published years later in the International Directory of Company Histories, is unusually candid about why. Beaver's sales climbed steadily through the 70s, the account concedes, rapidly making it a leader in its industry. But profits lagged behind what Molson had anticipated. The explanation that followed was a confession dressed as analysis. Molson eventually learned that the two industries, beer and hardware, operate on fundamentally different logics. The beer industry functions in a controlled market. Governments regulate the sale and manufacture of alcoholic products. Prices are managed. Competition is bounded. Distribution is channeled through provincial liquor boards. The hardware industry operates in a relatively free market, where margins are thin. Competition is relentless. Customer knowledge matters, and nobody regulates how many stores you can open or where. A brewery executive accustomed to controlled distribution, managed pricing, and captive provincial markets looked at a hardware chain and saw a retail business. What he didn't see, what he couldn't see, because nothing in the beer industry had prepared him to see it, was that the value of Aikenhead's was not in its stores or its inventory. It was in the accumulated knowledge of its people and the trust of its trade customers. That knowledge couldn't be merged with a lumber company by drawing lines on an org chart. That trust couldn't be transferred by changing the letterhead. Through the 1970s and 80s, Molson ran Aikenhead's the way a conglomerate runs a subsidiary it doesn't fully understand. The Temperance Street flagship continued to operate. Some branches remained open. But the investment in stock depth, in staff expertise, in the trade customer relationships that had been the company's competitive advantage for a century, that investment quietly drained away. Nobody announced the decline. Nobody held a press conference to say that the single screw from the right bin service model was being abandoned. The knowledge simply wasn't replaced as the old hands retired. The bins weren't restocked with the same obsessive completeness. The building aged. By 1992, 21 years after the purchase, Molson had pared the original Aikenhead's chain down to a single downtown Toronto store. 22 outlets reduced to one. The Temperance Street building still stood, but the empire it had anchored was gone. Not destroyed by competition. Not killed by free trade or foreign imports or technological disruption. Starved, slowly, by owners who had paid $3 million for something they never learned how to feed. Chapter 7. The Enemy's General. What happened next is one of the stranger episodes in Canadian retail history. Having spent 2 decades failing to understand the hardware business, Molson suddenly understood something else entirely: that Home Depot was coming. By the late 1980s, the Home Depot Inc. of Atlanta, Georgia, had become the most successful retail concept in American history. Co-founded in 1978 by Bernie Marcus and Arthur Blank, 2 executives who'd been fired from the Handy Dan home improvement chain in a corporate dispute, Home Depot had grown from 4 stores in 1979 to over 350 by 1994. The model was simple in concept and devastating in execution. Warehouse-format stores of 100,000 square feet or more, stocked with 35,000 items, priced below every traditional competitor, and staffed with orange-aproned associates trained to walk customers through any project. The stores were not beautiful. They were not charming. The concrete floors were bare. The steel shelves were industrial, and the merchandise was stacked to the ceiling on wooden pallets. But the prices were lower, the selection was broader, and the stores never closed at 5 o'clock on a Tuesday because the owner needed to get home for dinner. By 1990, Home Depot was expanding at a rate that made its northern arrival a matter of when, not whether. Molson, sitting on a single surviving Aikenhead store and a struggling Beaver lumber chain, saw the threat clearly and executed a preemptive move that was either brilliantly pragmatic or deeply cynical, depending on when you judge it. They hired the enemy's general. Stephen Bebis was a retail lifer, trained at Sears, seasoned at Grossman's Lumber, and most critically, a veteran of Home Depot itself. He joined Home Depot in 1984 when it had just 14 stores and risen to vice president and general merchandise manager of the company's Mid-South division, a division running at over $6 billion in annual sales by the time he left. Bebis knew every detail of the Home Depot model. The warehouse layout, the pricing strategy, the vendor relationships, the associate training system, the philosophy of high volume and low margin that crushed traditional hardware retailers the way a river crushes a sandbar. He knew it because he'd helped build it. Molson recruited him to Toronto in 1991 with a single mandate: build a Canadian copy of Home Depot before the real Home Depot could cross the border. The vehicle was a new corporate entity. Aikenhead's Home Improvement Warehouse Inc. was incorporated on May 3, 1991, under the Canada Business Corporations Act. The Aikenhead's trademark, the same name that had hung over the Temperance Street door since 1893, was formally assigned from Beaver Lumber to the new warehouse entity on July 21, 1992. The name was being repurposed, stripped of its meaning, and bolted onto a format its originators wouldn't have recognized. The first store opened in April 1992 in Scarborough, in the eastern suburbs of Toronto. 125,000 square feet, 35,000 different items, teal and turquoise signage, teal aprons for the associates, a storefront that, as the Rotman School of Management case study noted with academic understatement, greatly resembled Home Depot. Because of course it did. The man building it had spent 6 years building the original. Bevis moved fast. Over the next 2 years, the Aikenhead's improvement warehouse chain expanded to approximately 12 operating stores, with 10 more planned, reaching into Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia. By his own account, and Bevis was never modest about the achievement, the chain reached over $1 billion in sales in just 3 years. The number should be treated with caution. Molson's own financial reports for the first full year under Home Depot's partial ownership would show substantially lower revenue. But the speed of the build-out was real. Within 3 years of the Scarborough opening, there was a functional, large-format home improvement chain operating under a Canadian name, staffed by Canadian associates, backed by Molson Capital, and designed in every particular to match the Atlanta original that was bearing down on the border. The only problem was the obvious one. You can copy a competitor's format. You can hire his executives and replicate his floor plan and match his prices. What you can't do is outrun a company that has 350 stores to your $20 billion in annual revenue to your $1 billion, and the institutional momentum of 15 years of continuous American expansion. Molson had built a defensive copy, but a copy, by definition, can never be the original, and the original was coming whether Molson was ready or not. Chapter 8. The border opens. NAFTA took effect on the 1st of January, 1994. 14 days later, Walmart announced it would buy Canada's 120 Woolco stores. 5 weeks after that, on February 8, 1994, Home Depot announced that it had purchased a 75% stake in Aikenhead's home improvement warehouse from Molson. 3 American retail giants entering Canada in the same calendar quarter. Walmart, Costco, already expanding aggressively, and now Home Depot. It was the most concentrated foreign retail entry shock in modern Canadian retail history, and it landed on a country whose own retail infrastructure, Eaton's, Simpson's, Zellers, Woolco, Beaver Lumber, Aikenhead's, had been built behind a tariff wall that was now, piece by piece, coming down. The Home Depot deal was negotiated by Bevis and overseen on the Molson side by CEO Mickey Cohen. On the Atlanta side, the decision-makers were Home Depot's co-founders, Bernie Marcus and Arthur Blank. Marcus, who would live to 95 before his death in 2024, was explicit about why buying Aikenhead's made sense. The acquisition, he said, short-circuits the whole process of entering a foreign market. Home Depot got an instant 12-store footprint. It got 17 reserve development sites across the Greater Toronto Area, Canada's largest market. It got a trained workforce of 3,000 associates who already knew the warehouse format, because Bevis had taught them the same playbook he'd learned in Atlanta. And it got the name, the Aikenhead's name, 164 years old, recognized by every tradesman in Ontario, as a transitional bridge while the orange signs were manufactured. The price was either $150 million or $200 million, depending on the source. The Rotman School case study and the Toronto Star cited the higher figure. Molson's own filings and the Financial Post data group reported the lower one. The most likely reconciliation is that 150 million bought the equity stake, with additional development obligations and transaction terms pushing the total deal value closer to 200 million. Either way, the return on Molson's original $3 million investment was extraordinary, 50 to 66 times the purchase price in 23 years. But what Molson was selling was not what it had bought. It had bought Aikenhead's Hardware, a 141-year-old trade hardware retailer with 22 stores, a Temperance Street cathedral, and generational customer relationships. What it sold was Aikenhead's home improvement warehouse, a 3-year-old big-box clone with 12 stores, a Scarborough address, and a business model copied from the buyer. The name was the same. Everything underneath it had been replaced. There were no other public bidders. The Rotman case study is clear that Home Depot identified Aikenhead's as an acquisition target that would suit their needs. The founders didn't have to look far. Molson had been signaling a retreat from retail for 2 years. The warehouse chain, in retrospect, had been built to be sold. The billion-dollar sales run, the rapid expansion into 3 provinces, the hiring of a Home Depot executive to run a Home Depot copy. All of it reads, in hindsight, less like a competitive strategy and more like a shop window dressed for a buyer who was already walking toward the door. One retail analyst, quoted in the Winnipeg Free Press on March 5, 1995, captured the logic with bleak precision. Molson, the analyst said, was getting at least something for their trouble, rather than holding out and being crushed. That sentence deserves to sit in the record without commentary. It is its own eulogy. Chapter 9. Same People, New Aprons. The week of February 13, 1994, 5 days after the deal was announced, 17 Home Depot executives flew in from Atlanta. Finance, human resources, systems, strategy, merchandising. They toured every Aikenhead store. The Rotman case study records what happened next. The visit set off a firestorm of rumors about mass firings and the imminent arrival of executives from the United States. 3,000 employees in 12 stores, watching executives from Atlanta walk their aisles with clipboards. Nobody had to explain what that meant. The body language of an acquisition is universal. The visitors measure. They count. They compare. The staff watches and waits. Stephen Bebis moved to contain the damage. Between February 10 and April 7, 1994, weekly Aikenhead's newsletters were published and distributed to every store. The phrase "business as usual" was repeated until it lost all meaning, which is what happens to a phrase when the people hearing it know it isn't true. Bebis also wrote a letter to Aikenhead's 3,000 employees. The language was textbook acquirer reassurance, the kind of prose that sounds warm on the page and cold in the cafeteria. Home Depot's desire to enter a partnership with us is a tribute to our success, the letter read. They like what they see, from our friendly, well-trained associates and first-rate management team to the design of our stores. For these reasons, little will change in your day-to-day work. It will be business as usual. The letter described the workforce as the most important asset this company has, and insisted that Aikenhead's success has been built upon the expertise of associates like you. Every sentence was technically true, and every associate reading it understood that the word partnership meant purchase, that little will change meant everything will change on someone else's timeline, and that being called the most important asset by a company that has just been sold is the corporate equivalent of being told you're wonderful as you're being shown the door. The teal aprons came off. The orange aprons went on. A banner was hung in the stores. Same people, new aprons. It was meant as reassurance, as a promise that the human knowledge, the decades of trade expertise, the man who could identify a Robertson head by sight, would survive the color change. But the phrase also contained its own contradiction. If the people were the same, why change the aprons? If the expertise was what mattered, why erase the name? The banner announced continuity in the same breath that it announced erasure. Same people, new identity. The implication was that the name, Aikenhead's, 164 years old, carried across 5 generations from an Irish clerk's first day on the job, was just a color, just an apron, something you could swap out on a Tuesday afternoon and nobody would notice the difference. The New York Times, reporting on February 9, 1994, stripped away the reassurance and stated the plan plainly. Home Depot, the paper reported, will convert all the Aikenhead stores to Home Depots, replacing their turquoise signs with the bright orange colors of Home Depot. The final Aikenhead's newsletter, dated April 7, 1994, dropped the pretense. It announced that Home Depot Canada would operate as an autonomous division, with Bebis as president. Bebis pitched the operation to the Atlanta leadership as the jewel in the crown of Home Depot. The word Aikenheads would not appear on a storefront again. By April 1995, roughly 14 months after the deal closed, the conversion was effectively complete. Every turquoise sign had been replaced. Every teal apron had been swapped for orange. 164 years of continuous branding, stretching from Joseph Ridout's ironmongery, through James Aikenhead's partnership through 5 generations of family ownership, through Molson's conglomerate mismanagement, through Bebis's frantic 3-year warehouse sprint, all of it compressed into a single transition year and painted over in Home Depot orange. The first full fiscal year under joint ownership produced an operating loss of $4.4 million and sales of $614 million, far below plan. Bebis blamed the economy publicly. The housing market, the economy is in a depression, not a recession, he told the press. It's the worst it's been since 1982, and it affected our business. In June 1995, Home Depot cut its Canadian expansion plans by half. In December 1995, Bebis resigned, having, by his own account, originally planned to leave Home Depot within 2 years of the acquisition. The man Molson had hired to build the copy, and who had then brokered the sale of the copy to the original, walked away 22 months after the deal closed. Behind him, 3,000 associates wore orange aprons in stores that no longer carried the name they'd been hired under. Ahead of them was Annette Verschuren. Chapter 10. The Orange Tide. In March 1996, Home Depot recruited a Cape Breton dairy farmer's daughter named Annette Verschuren to replace Bebis as president of Home Depot Canada. She'd come from Michaels of Canada, where she'd built the chain to 17 stores in 26 months. Arthur Blank, Home Depot's co-founder, later admitted to her that of all the hirings he'd ever made, he'd taken the most heat for hers. Because she had no hardware sector experience, and because she was a woman in a business whose culture was built around men in tool belts. It didn't matter. Verschuren didn't need to know the difference between a Robertson and a Phillips. She needed to know how to open stores. And she opened them with a methodical determination that made Bebis's 3-year sprint look restrained. Under her 15-year leadership, from 1996 to 2011, Home Depot Canada expanded from 19 stores to 179. Revenues grew from approximately $600 million to over $6 billion annually. The 100th Canadian store opened in Thunder Bay, Ontario, in November 2003. By the time Verschuren stepped down, Home Depot Canada employed more than 27,000 associates across every province in the country. The arithmetic of conquest is worth sitting with for exactly one moment. In 1971, Molson paid $3 million for Aikenhead's hardware. In 1994, it sold 75% of the warehouse successor to Home Depot for somewhere between $150 and $200 million. Molson retained its remaining 25% stake and exercised a put option in 1998, selling to Home Depot for an additional sum reported variously as $262 million and $375 million, depending on the source and the tranche. The total cost to Home Depot for full ownership of the Canadian operation fell somewhere between $412 million and $525 million. What did Home Depot buy for that money? 12 warehouse stores, 17 development sites, 3,000 trained associates, and a name it would erase within 14 months. What did it build from that purchase? 179 stores, $6 billion in annual revenue, 30,000 employees, the single largest American retail conquest of the Canadian market in the NAFTA era. And what did Canada lose? The Temperance Street building was demolished in the 1990s for the Bay Adelaide Centre redevelopment. 6 floors of taxed tractors, replaced by glass and steel office space. The city did save one thing. The E.J. Lennox designed 1894 Comet Cycle Company facade that Aikenheads had once occupied. They dismantled it, moved it 120 feet east, and remounted it on 9 Temperance Street. In 1996, the city repealed the heritage designation on the original building site and applied it to the relocated facade, preserving the face of something whose body had been torn down. One Toronto historian, surveying the result, called it absolutely a historical disaster. The corporate entity itself, Aikenhead's Home Improvement Warehouse Inc., incorporated May 3, 1991, was formally dissolved on September 23, 2003. 12 years of legal existence. The trademark remains on the Canadian Intellectual Property Office Register, technically alive, effectively dormant, a name without a store, a brand without a shelf. Chapter 11. Plot F. Circle. Lot. Molson sold Beaver Lumber to Home Hardware in 1999. The cooperative model, the one Walter Hatchbourne had built in St. Jacobs, Ontario, starting in 1964, where every store was independently owned but pooled purchasing through the central co-op, absorbed what the brewery conglomerate couldn't hold. Home Hardware grew to over 1,100 stores. It is still there. The cooperative survived because it was built to survive, structured from the ground up so that no single owner could sell the whole thing to an outsider. No single boardroom could decide to hand the keys to Atlanta. The contrast with Aikenheads is not subtle. It is structural. Today, if you stand on the northeast corner of King and Yonge Streets in Toronto, the corner where Joseph Rideau opened his ironmongery in 1830, you will find no plaque, no marker, no sign that anything of consequence happened there. The intersection is one of the busiest in the country. Glass towers on every corner. Foot traffic that would have been unimaginable to the 2,860 people who lived in muddy York when a man decided to sell nails and hinges from a storefront on the unpaved road. At 9 Temperance Street, the relocated Lennox facade stands against a modern office building, a face without a building, the architectural equivalent of a death mask. The 6 floors behind it are gone. The bins of single screws are gone. The men who could identify a Robertson head by touch are gone. A few blocks away, the Bay Adelaide Centre occupies the ground where the flagship stood, its lobby polished and climate-controlled in a way that the old hardware floors, with their machine oil smell and rattling handcarts, never were and never aspired to be. At Trent University in Peterborough, a quiet archive holds what the commercial world discarded. Fonds 89014. A retail day book covering July 10, 1835 to September 5, 1839. Its entries in pounds, shillings, and pence, the currency of a colony that hadn't yet decided what country it would become. Wholesale price list from 1895 to 1899. A commemorative booklet from 1930, marking the firm's 100th anniversary during the worst economic crisis the world had ever seen. A 9-page company history, unpublished, written for no audience larger than the family that commissioned it. The daybook is the thing. A ledger, handwritten, recording transactions in a hardware store on the northern edge of the British Empire 4 years before the colony it served, had a name other than York. Every entry is a nail sold, a hinge fitted, a lock delivered. Every entry is evidence that something existed, that on a specific day, in a specific year, a specific person walked into a specific store and bought a specific thing for a specific purpose. The mundane made permanent by ink. At Mount Pleasant Cemetery in Toronto, 5 generations of Aikenheads share a family plot. Plot F. Circle. Lot 8. James, the clerk from Kilkenny, who arrived in famine year and spent 56 years building a name. Thomas, who completed the takeover and put the family name alone on the door. James T.E., who expanded the empire and died suddenly in 1948. John Wilfred, who held the company steady through the post-war decades. And the later family, the ones who inherited a legacy they could no longer carry, who sold it for $3 million to a brewery that didn't know what it had bought. The living descendants are still out there. A genealogical thread on a hobbyist blog, posted in 2023 and 2024, shows family members tracing the Aikenhead and Hilton and Marshall lines. People separated from the original James by 170 years and 6 or 7 generations, still curious about where they came from. Still typing the name into search engines and finding, mostly, references to an orange warehouse. If you walk into any Home Depot in Canada today, and there are 182 of them in every province, you will find concrete floors, steel shelves, merchandise stacked on pallets, and orange-aproned associates trained to direct you to the correct aisle. You will not find a man who has worked there for 30 years and can identify every fastener in the building by sight. You will not buy a single screw pulled from a wooden bin by someone who asks what the application is before reaching for the right one. The orange apron replaced the teal one. The warehouse replaced the cathedral. The SKU lookup replaced the man who knew. Aikenhead's hardware survived the rebellion and the fire, and 2 wars, and the depression, and the oil shock, and the recession. It survived 141 years of everything the country could throw at a business built on nails and hinges and knowledge. It could not survive being sold. Not once, twice. First to a brewery that didn't understand it, then to a competitor that didn't need it, only needed its footprint, its development sites, and its 14 months of transitional branding. The name did the rest of its work in silence, fading from the storefronts one by one until the last turquoise sign came down and the orange one went up, and somebody, somewhere, folded an apron that had been teal and dropped it in a bin. 164 years, tax to tractors, a single screw if you wanted, gone.